When the Civil War began, the Confederate Army was well stocked in every aspect: leadership, troops, and, of course, the basic necessities of life: food, water, shelter, and clothing. As the war progressed, however, supplies began to run out. The Confederacy could barely manage to support themselves, much less a horde of enemy soldiers. The Belle Isle Confederate prison was situated on an 80-mile strip of land in the center of the James River. The prisoners there were not provided with barracks. Instead, they were given tents. However, these tents were lacking in both quality and quantity and failed to provide their few inhabitants with a sufficient source of shelter. Over the winter, many men died from exposure. The Andersonville prison has long been noted as one of the most terrifying experiences that a prisoner of the Confederacy could endure. Built to house an overflow of prisoners from Belle Isle, little preparation went into the prison's construction. New premises were needed immediately and without frivolities. And so, Andersonville was merely a field surrounded by an enormous wooden stockade. No shelter was provided for the prisoners. Instead, they burrowed into the ground, using spare bits of wood and cloth as roofs. However, shelter was not the only thing the prison lacked. Food and water rations were always tainted and sometimes non-existent. What rations were provided were uncooked and rarely accompanied by utensils. Cornmeal was ground with so much husk that it caused bowel problems. Meals were also void of vegetables, which brought on an epidemic of scurvy. The camp had only one water source, which was used for two purposes: to hydrate the prisoners and to dispose of their waste. The men at Camp Ford were yet another example of prisoners left without shelter. These soldiers, however, were much more resourceful when it came to creating substitutions. Though some resorted to the old standby of burrowing into the ground, others constructed makeshift log houses and soddies. The Cahaba prison was located in an incomplete red brick warehouse, incomplete being the key word in that statement. There was a gaping hole in the center of the roof, leaving 1,600 feet of the inside unprotected from the elements. Because of this, many men died from exposure. The prison was also severely overcrowded, which led to the spread of germs and bacteria, as well as lice. Each man had only 7.5 square feet to call his own. As at Andersonville, the water supply at Cahaba was poisoned. The prison's water flowed through an open gutter for 200 yards before reaching the prison, and managed to pick up all sorts of vermin on the way. Men were so deprived of food, clothing, and water that some of them actually banded together to form one of the first prison gangs. These men were called muggers and targeted newcomers. They would render said newcomer defenseless, then rob them of their keepsakes and valuables. These items were then traded with the guards and with fellow inmates in order to obtain extra supplies. The men at Danville are said to have fought for food like starving dogs. This proves how malnourished and starved they were, for their rations were infested with all varieties of vermin. There were rat feces in the rice, bugs in the peas, and worms in the cabbage soup. Eventually, the prisoners grew so desperate for a substitution for food that they resorted to whittling splinters of wood from the rafters and boiling them to make coffee. The Confederacy's use of their resources and the manner in which they chose to distribute them produced one major result: death. Due to a lack of proper shelter, many men simply died from exposure. Even if they managed to survive the bitter cold of winter, it was more than likely that they would pass on due to some disease brought on by their polluted food and water rations.